right, today we are going to talk a bit about the age of Jackson. And we call it the age of Jackson because it's about more than just his presidency. You can see the time frame here is 1824 to 1840. And so we're really looking at a shift in the way that politics works in America. We're looking at a shift in the relationship between the people and government. And we're just looking at a totally new attitude about the role of the president. So let's give a little context here. America is trying to establish itself as a democratic society. After the War of 1812, obviously, there's nationalism. There's the so-called era of good feelings where there's not really any partisanship. But people are starting to visit the United States from Europe and recording their impressions of the country. One of them, most notably, is a French aristocrat named Alexis de Tocqueville, who writes a book called Democracy in America. And upon his first visit to the United States after the Revolution and after the War of 1812, he's struck by the fact that you can't really tell the difference between rich people and poor people. It seems like America has become a classless society. He gets this impression because he shares a cab. They actually, yes, they did have taxi cabs back then, but they were horse-drawn carriages. He shares a cab with some commoners, and he notices that rich people and poor people, powerful people and powerless people sit shoulder to shoulder, they dress similarly, and they engage in conversations with one another. And that's something that never would happen in Europe. He likes the idea of social mobility in America, that if you work hard enough, you can move up in class. But he does wonder if this is going to lead to a country where everyone tries to conform to the same image and same attitude. And he's not sure whether or not that will be good or bad for America. I think we're still asking ourselves that question. America has become a very diverse country, but everybody kind of wants to portray themselves as middle class. Whether they're wealthy or whether they're poor, everybody is striving to be identified as somewhere in the middle because in a way that somehow makes you more authentically American. Let's talk a bit about the politics of the common man. So politics is really going to shift towards catering to average voters, not wealthy people, not necessarily super educated people, but just common people. We have a couple of things at play here. First of all, rapid population growth. More people are immigrating to America. The birth rate is going up. America is expanding into other parts of the continent. And so you've got more voters than ever before. That's also being helped by a couple of other factors. As you can see, this statistic that the electorate, which is the number of eligible voters, has grown by 7 times between 1824 and 1840. What's causing that? Well, something called universal white suffrage or universal white male suffrage. States are removing property requirements and religious qualifications to be allowed to vote. So essentially, any man who is white, who is over the age of 18, is being allowed to vote. And so that expands the number of eligible voters. Sorry, ladies, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. And also African Americans. And also, yeah. But because poor whites in America outnumber rich whites, politicians need to start catering to those more common voters. And so you start to see the messaging change. The old era of the highly educated, very cultured politicians like Jefferson are going away. And we're getting more of a kind of a rough around the edges kind of politics. We also see that we're moving towards party nominating conventions. So instead of just, like, for example, John Adams, he was more of a common man than a lot of the others, but he was seen as the heir apparent to Washington because he was his vice president. James Madison had been Jefferson's right-hand man throughout most of his adult life, and so it made sense that Madison would be the next in line from Jefferson. But that idea is starting to go away. Instead of the insiders choosing who the next person will be to run, they're using this nominating convention where delegates who are regular people, they go to these conventions and they vote on who they want to be on the ballot. And so it's a more democratic way of choosing who the candidates will be for each party. Also, the Electoral College, we know, is the legitimate way that the president gets elected. But for a long time, the electors were chosen by party insiders. Now we're starting to see that the electors, the people who actually get to vote in the Electoral College, are being chosen by popular vote. And so this is actually true today in many states. In many states in the United States, you can actually run to be an elector. So let me try to explain this. You are holding a campaign to promote yourself as a responsible person who should be allowed to cast the vote for president for your state. And so your people are electing you to then elect the president. It's really kind of a weird indirect thing. But it's the point I'm trying to make is that the the process of deciding who the candidates will be and who gets elected is being put out to more people than ever before. There are more people involved in the decisions than ever before. What else? So we did have a brief period, like 8 years during Monroe's presidency, where partisan politics kind of drifted away. That was the era of good feelings. That was the time where people were all kind of unifying behind the National Republican Party. But what we do start to see is that the two-party system does come back. The two-party system will come back with a vengeance after the election of 1824, and I'll explain a bit about that in a future slide. So the Democratic Republicans end up dropping the Republican part of their name, and eventually under Andrew Jackson will just be known as Democrats. And that's actually the same party that exists today. It can trace its roots all the way back to the party of Jackson, although it's gone through many changes over the years, regionally and ideologically. It is the modern Democratic Party that we still have today, can trace its roots back to this Democratic Party from the 1830s and 40s. As we mentioned, the Federalist Party dies out because of the bad public image that was created after the War of 1812 when they met at the Hartford Convention and considered seceding from the Union. And so we don't see a Federalist presence anymore. Those people who had been Federalists kind of scatter and go to different parties. The National Republicans that had been so popular during the era of good feelings, actually many of them form a new party called the Whig Party. And the Whigs take their name from an anti-monarchy party in England. So during the British, or the English Civil War, I should say, there were people who were pushing back against the idea of monarchy and wanting to bring about more democratic rule in their country. And so the reason that these Americans choose that name is directly an attack on Andrew Jackson and the brand of politics that he practices. They're essentially calling him a monarch. They're calling him a tyrant. And their party is anti-tyrannical, anti-monarchical. And so the Whig Party actually forms as an anti-Jackson party. So as I said, the era of good feelings is over. It was short-lived. It was fun while it lasted. But we're going to see a really divisive partisan era emerge. Popular campaigning also becomes a new thing during this time period. So the fact that campaigns now include a component where the candidate goes and makes speeches and public appearances in different places around the country, maybe even knocks on people's doors and meets them in person. It's the kind of idea we have associated with politics today, where if you want to get elected to office, you have to shake a lot of hands and kiss a lot of babies. So the idea of having a campaign slogan, having these meet and greet events, stump speeches, which we still call them today, is when a politician would go out in public and kind of make a speech to talk about what their ideals are and what their policies will be. They literally were called stump speeches because candidates would get up on a tree stump to put themselves about a foot up above the crowd so that everyone could see them, and then they would talk about their policies. But rallies, flags, posters, banners, a lot of the stuff that we associate with the patriotism that came out of the War of 1812 is now making its way into politics. We're really looking at political parties more in the way that we look at, maybe in a modern context, sports teams, where you are affiliated with an allegiance to this party or this candidate, and you kind of promote it publicly everywhere you go. Another major feature of this shift in politics during this time period is something known as the spoils system. And this is something that's used extensively throughout Jackson's presidency, but it's the idea that loyalty is important in politics. And so it's based on the old phrase, to the victors belong the spoils of war. Essentially, if you win a war, you get everything. You get the land, you get the resources, you get control of the people that you've conquered. Jackson, very much as a military guy, viewed politics as a battle to be won. And when you win the battle, you win everything and you get to do whatever you want. His political strategist was a guy named Martin Van Buren from New York. Martin Van Buren will go on to be president later, but he was nicknamed the Little Magician because he was able to kind of pull the strings behind the scenes to make politics work in his candidate's favor. He did this through this system called patronage, which is really a nice way of saying bribery. If you went out and worked tirelessly to try to get Jackson elected, then Martin Van Buren would make sure that you got a job in the administration. So your loyalty to the candidate will be rewarded with a job after the candidate wins. And that's pretty common in politics today. If you work on a campaign and the person that you're working for on the campaign wins the office, you usually get a job working for them throughout their administration. And so this motivates people to go out and actively campaign for Jackson because it means that they might end up getting rewarded with a really cushy government job. The other way to look at that is it's total corruption, right? You're not giving the job to somebody because they're qualified for it. You're giving the job to somebody because they were loyal. And loyalty is great, but it doesn't necessarily make you qualified for the job. I remember a modern example in the George W. Bush administration. Bush had put in power of FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Association or agency. That's the government agency that deals with like disaster relief and hurricane relief and all that. He put a guy in charge of FEMA who his only previous experience in a leadership role was that he was the president of the Arabian Horse Association of America. Okay, that's a thing. And he was the head of that thing. And he had to manage people and budgets and all of that. But did he have the leadership experience to head the entire emergency management agency for disaster relief in America? Probably not. But he was a loyal Bush supporter. And right around the time that he was given this role in the government to head FEMA, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans, and it was one of the worst natural disasters in American history, and the government's response was slow and inadequate, and a lot of people died who didn't need to. And so maybe this guy was not the right pick to be the head of FEMA, especially during such a disaster. Right? So there are consequences for patronage appointments. Sometimes they're good, sometimes the people do a good job, but generally speaking, you're giving them the job for the wrong reason. You're rewarding them for their political loyalty. And what that also means is that when you're no longer loyal to the politician, you lose your job. Right? So loyalty goes a long way. A lot of times these patronage positions are given out because the politician wants to be able to control what these appointees will do. All right, let's talk about the election of 1824 because this is super important. This to me is the turning point between old politics and new politics, because I think a lot of what we see in modern politics has parallels to the election of 1824. So here are your two candidates, John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. Okay, John Quincy Adams had been Secretary of State to James Monroe, the son of a former president, John Adams. He's got name recognition, but he's going up against Andrew Jackson, who was a war hero from 1812. And so this is going to be a really interesting campaign because it pits a New England elitist in John Quincy Adams against a rough and ready Westerner, right? Somebody from Tennessee and somebody who grew up a good part of his life in South Carolina. So a Southerner, Westerner versus a New Englander. The other thing is that there's two other candidates in the race, Henry Clay and William Crawford. And so there's four major candidates vying for the presidency. None of them get a majority in the Electoral College. And so the way the Constitution is written is that if there's no majority in the Electoral College, then the House of Representatives is going to essentially decide the election in a runoff. And so what ends up happening is that William Crawford, he gets essentially sick and drops out of the race. Henry Clay is the current Speaker of the House, and so there's like a major conflict of interest there because if he's running for president and he also controls the House, couldn't he then manipulate the vote in the House in his favor? So he gets dropped from the ballot. And so it becomes a runoff between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And what ends up happening is that even though Jackson had more popular votes in the election, the House elects John Quincy Adams. And Andrew Jackson says that the election was rigged. Tell me if this sounds familiar at all. The election was rigged, it was corrupt, that the votes need to be recounted, that John Quincy Adams had a deal with Henry Clay behind the scenes. Henry Clay made John Quincy Adams president, and in return, John Quincy Adams was going to give Clay a role in his administration. And it turned out a couple months later, when John Quincy Adams did become president, that he nominated Henry Clay to be Secretary of State. So there may have been some truth behind Jackson's allegation that this was a rigged election, but Jackson never let it go. He refused to believe that he lost the election. He harbored this bitterness for 4 years and did everything that he could to attack John Quincy Adams, to block his progress, to criticize him in the press, to get his followers, his very loyal, very rabid followers, to do everything that they could to make sure that John Quincy Adams did not last more than 4 years as president. And so Andrew Jackson harbors this bitterness and this antagonism, not only towards the presidency, but towards establishment politics in general. He doesn't like Congress. He doesn't like the Supreme Court. He doesn't like people who don't support him. He doesn't see himself necessarily as a president for the people who are on the other side of the aisle. He believes that the people who are loyal to him are the people he represents, and those are the people that he is going to make policy to protect. Again, I hope that you're hearing some modern parallels in the story that I'm telling here. Right, so we don't have specific evidence that John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay sat down in a room somewhere and hashed out this bargain. But it looks really bad. It looks like there was a deal that was struck, and Jackson probably had just cause to be angry. All right. So John Quincy Adams, I'm going to breeze through his presidency. There's not a lot to say. He oversees the implementation of a major tariff in 1828. This is actually part of Henry Clay's American system. It's known as the Tariff of Abominations. Especially southern states hate the tariff. They think it's too high. They think that it benefits the North and hurts the South. Because the North is now starting to get into manufacturing a little bit. The South is way behind. They're still based on agriculture. And so then the South has to buy most of its finished goods from Europe still, which means they're going to have to pay most of the tariffs. Loyal Jackson supporters in Congress did everything that they could to block legislation that John Quincy Adams wanted to pass. He was a miserable president in terms of not being able to get anything done. He hated the job by the time he left. Like his father, he only had one term in office. Interestingly enough, after his presidency, he runs for Congress and gets elected to the House of Representatives from Massachusetts. And he ends up being a much more effective lawmaker than he was an executive. I can't think of another time in history where a former president ran for Congress. The only other parallel that I have is that William Howard Taft, after his presidency, became a Supreme Court justice. And that was the only other time where a former president left office and then became a prominent member of a different branch of the government. All right, so let's fast forward to the election of 1828, which is really the main event here. Historians said it was the dirtiest election ever, like the nastiest, most negative election ever. And I put in parentheses until 2016, and I could put in other parentheses until 2020, because I really feel like the last two presidential elections have been super toxic. The election wasn't even focused on the candidates' viewpoints or policies. It was really just focused on them as people. And so there are all kinds of allegations about the personal conduct of the candidates. Jackson was accused of cheating on his wife with somebody who was also still married. And then Jackson accused John Quincy Adams of like providing female escorts to the Russian diplomats and having a gambling operation in the White House, and then Jackson was dueling with people and drinking too much and killing India. I mean, it was just like a mess. And so the election wasn't about politics or wasn't about policy at all. It was about politics. It was about destroying your opponent's reputation to try to win the vote. Let's look at this electoral map for a second here, right? The states, the areas in yellow voted for Jackson. The areas in brown voted for John Quincy Adams. You can see that there are some clear regional patterns here. New England is solidly for John Quincy Adams. New Jersey, part of Maryland, and Delaware are also for Adams, but everywhere else votes for Jackson. And Jackson is super popular in places where agriculture is the main backbone of the economy. He's also very popular in the more rural areas, the less densely populated areas, the areas that are less diverse, the areas that are away from the coastlines, away from where the elite landowners live and bankers live and business interests live. He is catering to the common voter, and common voters love him. They see themselves in him. He's tough. He lives on the frontier. He fights Indians. He speaks his mind. He's not prim and proper and polished and educated and snobby. I like this guy. He represents me. If you only remember four things about Andrew Jackson, remember these four words: banks, Indians, tariffs, and loyalty. Those four words summarize Andrew Jackson's presidency. Um, you can see in the political cartoon on the left, he's carrying a smoking gun, and you see a guy laying in the pool of his own blood behind him, presumably a member of Congress, probably Henry Clay. He didn't actually kill Henry Clay, but he wanted to. And he says anybody else to care to discuss politics. On the right, you see a political cartoon from the time period, and it's titled King Andrew the First. And you can see that he's stepping on a torn up constitution, and he's holding a piece of paper that, if you look closely, it says veto, and carrying a scepter, and obviously very royally dressed. This was the way that they tried to criticize him in the press. So Jackson as president. What do you need to know about Jackson as president? He was super tight with the budget. He didn't want to spend federal money because he thought that spending federal money hurt the common man. He saw the government as being too much in debt, and he thought that states should have the real power, and so he didn't want to increase the federal power over the economy. He was vengeful. If he felt that somebody was disloyal to him or crossed him or tried to block him, he kept a list of enemies very close to the vest, and he would do whatever he could to get back at them. He has a reputation as an Indian fighter. He comes into the presidency with a reputation for he went in on an unauthorized raid into Florida and slaughtered a bunch of Seminole Indians who had been attacking settlements in Georgia. He's a dueler. I think the story is that he had at least two bullets from previous duels permanently lodged in his body, and he would fight at the drop of a hat. Right, so as I said before, he was born in South Carolina, but he made his home in Tennessee, and so he portrayed himself as a Western frontiersman. Historians question whether he's actually a keeper of Jefferson's legacy. Like, we know that Jefferson also believed in the farmer and in states' rights and individual liberties, but Jackson, he kind of like is almost like a Jeffersonian poser. Like he says that he believes in the ideals of Jefferson, but then he goes against that in many of his actions. But remember, Jefferson was also a little hypocritical in the way that he conducted his presidency, considering his beliefs. Veto. He used the veto more than all of the previous presidents combined. He, multiple times throughout his presidency, blocked legislation because he felt that it empowered the wrong people or that it gave the federal government too much authority. And so it's not illegal or corrupt to use the veto. He has the power to use it, but he tends to veto more laws than he approves. He builds and establishes for the first time what historians call the kitchen cabinet. And this is not an official cabinet of advisors, but of friends that he trusts, many of them involved in the media, like newspaper editors, that he invites into the White House through the back kitchen door so that there's no public record of them visiting. And he gets counsel from people who are not skilled in government, but are more skilled in image and public opinion. And so he can float an idea to them and have them put that idea in an opinion article in their newspaper. He can see how the public reacts to it and then decide how he's going to move forward on it. It's actually a very shrewd way to deal with the public and with politics. But again, to make another parallel between Jackson and Trump, one of Trump's most trusted advisors is one of the nighttime news hosts on Fox News, Sean Hannity. And supposedly, Trump and Hannity had almost daily conversations, and there were times where Trump would be tweeting stuff out like 5 minutes after Hannity said something on his show. And so it was very clear that there was this like connection, this symbiotic relationship between Trump and Sean Hannity. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose, depends on your political perspective. But it's another strong parallel between Trump and Jackson. Jackson believed in rotation in office. What that means is that he wanted to get lots of different people involved in government for short periods of time, give them training, give them sort of an insider's perspective of how government works, and then send them back to their home states to spread Jacksonian ideals. Right? So he was almost creating like an army of Jackson disciples that could then go out and spread his vision and his agenda to their own states. The other thing about rotation in office is you have to move people in and out of office pretty quickly because you've promised all these people jobs because they worked on your campaign. And so you can't keep them in office that long because you've got to kick them out and give the job to somebody else that you promised it to. And so he claims he's trying to grow the Democratic base, but what he's actually doing is trying to keep all of the promises of patronage that they made along the campaign trail. And in other cases, he's firing people who are not doing what he wants. I think he had 4 different secretaries of the Treasury during his 8 years because they wouldn't do the things that he wanted them to do with the debt and with the banks. And so again, he wanted to rid government of disloyal people and bring in people who would be personally loyal to him whenever possible. Okay, so I'm not going to get into this too in depth because you're watching a video and reading Jackson's speech about this, but one of the most controversial aspects of his presidency was the Cherokee Trail of Tears and the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Cherokee tribe, which was primarily based in Georgia, had actually used the legal system to defend their right to stay on the land. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that they had the right to stay on the land, and Andrew Jackson's response was John Marshall, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Essentially daring the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to try to stop him from removing the Cherokee from their land. Instead, he calls in the military and he does a forced march of, I think, 2,000 to 3,000 Cherokee Indians to Oklahoma, many of them dying along the way, and says that this is best for everybody. It's best for Native Americans. It's best for Americans. Everyone will be better off as a result. You can read his justification for it in his speech, and this is part of what you'll be responding to or writing a reflection on later in class today. And so you can see it wasn't actually only Cherokees, but also some other tribal members, Seminoles, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creeks, even Saxon Foxes up in Indiana, not in Indiana, excuse me, up in the Northwest Territories of the Louisiana Purchase that have not yet been established. And they get moved to Oklahoma, which will really become the new Indian Territory as the western frontier continues to push towards California. Another important moment in Jackson's presidency is the so-called nullification crisis. There's a debate going on in Congress about whether states have the right to nullify a tariff if they feel the tariff doesn't benefit them. And so they're debating the tariff, the 1828 so-called tariff of abominations, but they're also looking at a new proposed tariff that is on the books in 1832. John C. Calhoun is Jackson's vice president. That's that dashing looking young man in the top right corner of your screen. John C. Calhoun was the vice president at the time. He was from South Carolina. His loyalty was more to South Carolina than it was to the United States at this point, and he felt it was unfair for South Carolina to have to pay this tariff because it was benefiting infrastructure projects in the North, but not benefiting the people of South Carolina. And he actually left Washington and went to South Carolina and participated in a convention there where he spoke very passionately to the convention about South Carolina having the right to nullify the tariff if they so chose. And South Carolina actually considered seceding from the Union over this. Andrew Jackson was furious. He felt that Calhoun had double-crossed him, that Calhoun was trying to destroy Jackson's presidency. Calhoun ends up resigning as vice president. Jackson considers supporting a bill in Congress that would allow him to bring in the military to South Carolina and essentially declare martial law until tariffs were paid. It could have started the Civil War in 1832. It didn't, because at the last minute, Henry Clay came in and created a compromise bill that lowered the tariff to a rate that South Carolina could live with. Henry Clay, interestingly enough, kind of saves Jackson's political career over this, even though they were sworn enemies. And Henry Clay will gain the reputation of being known as the Great Compromiser because he seems to step in at moments where the country is about to fall apart and strike a deal. And we'll see it in other ways too. All right, the last thing that I think is super important for you to understand about Jackson is his distaste for the national bank. The second bank of the United States had been rechartered. This was vital to Henry Clay's American system. It was one of the three parts of his American system. And the bank is coming up for renewal. Excuse me. Andrew Jackson sees the bank as a tool of elite business people in America, and he thinks that it's harmful to the common man. And so he wants to not recharter the bank. He doesn't want to renew the bank's license to exist. And the bank's charter will expire in a couple of years if he doesn't do anything. But instead, he chooses a preemptive strike. He chooses to kill the bank before the charter expires. And a lot of it has to do with his personal issues with the president of the National Bank, a guy named Nicholas Biddle. And Nicholas Biddle was somebody who had been highly critical of Jackson on the campaign trail. He made comments, really disparaging comments about Jackson's wife. And then Jackson's wife died. And Jackson believed somehow that Biddle's criticism partially led to her death and that he was essentially holding Nicholas Biddle responsible for his wife's death. And so he was now just hell-bent to destroy Biddle's career. And one way to do that is to get rid of the bank, because if there's no bank, then Biddle can't be president of it anymore. So there were really more personal reasons for him destroying the bank than practical reasons for destroying the bank. He called it a multi-headed hydra. This is a fictional monster that could destroy and swallow up people whole. And he said that that's what the bank was, and he convinced his supporters that the bank had to go. It needed to be destroyed. Well, how do you destroy the bank? It had buildings, administrative buildings, but the bank is not one location. The bank is an institution that operates throughout the country. How do you destroy this thing? And the way that Jackson destroyed it was by redistributing the money that was held by the Second National Bank to local banks in states that were loyal to Jackson. His critics called these pet banks. So essentially he had, I think it was his fourth Secretary of the Treasury, withdraw all of the money from the National Bank and deposit it into more local banks, especially in the South and West. And again, if there's no money in the National Bank, then there's no need for a bank to manage the money. Therefore, there's no need for people to run the bank. Therefore, there's no need for Nicholas Biddle. He also used some of the federal funds to pay the national debt down to zero. He was the only president ever to pay the national debt off completely. And again, his logic was, if there's no debt to manage, there's no need for a bank. And if there's no bank, there's no corruption. Was he right about that? Not necessarily, right? And it turned out that not having a national bank became problematic for the United States. There was no way to manage the value of currency anymore. There was no way to deal with future borrowing. And one of the things that people were doing is they were running out to the West and trying to scramble to grab up land. It was speculative. They were speculating in land, which means they were buying land that they thought people would want to build on later at a low price and then selling it for more money later. But by doing that, people were getting into debt, like borrowing money to go buy this land and hoping it would go up in value. And so to try to slow that down, Jackson made a policy known as the Specie Circular. It was a letter that went out that essentially said the only way that you're allowed to buy land in the West from the federal government is you have to buy it in physical money, hard currency. You can't buy it with a loan. And banks started to tighten up their lending practices during this period, and it created a financial panic, which actually really hurt the American economy. And so, in a roundabout way, Jackson partially destroyed the American economy because of his need to have personal vengeance on people who had criticized him and his wife. Jackson believed that corruption was held in large institutions and that the way that you got rid of corruption was by getting rid of those large institutions. But what's interesting is that Jackson himself was corrupting large institutions through patronage. So he's claiming that he's here to, for lack of a better term, drain the swamp, but then he's putting more mud in the swamp with his own corrupt behaviors. Right, and so this leads to an 8-year period that's very tumultuous of Jackson's presidency, and then the heir apparent to his legacy, Martin Van Buren. Ironically, you'd think Jackson would have stayed in power as long as possible, but he respected the two-term tradition of Washington and stepped down after 8 years. Van Buren had been made his vice president after Calhoun resigned. Van Buren was a political genius. He was from New York, not from the West, and he was able to work the vote in his favor and get elected president. But because he took the presidency at a time when the economy was failing, he was associated with all of the economic failures and was nicknamed Martin Van Ruin. And so he only lasted 4 years as president. It was pretty miserable. He certainly wasn't as charismatic and as bold as Jackson, and so that was a tough act to follow for him. There's not really anything you need to know specifically about Van Buren's presidency other than he was associated with the economic failures caused by Jackson's presidency. Finally, in 1840, this is the last slide and the last campaign that we'll talk about, there's the so-called log cabin and hard cider campaign. And this is William Henry Harrison, the other hero of the War of 1812, the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, and his vice president, John Tyler. And their campaign slogan is, "Elect Tippecanoe and Tyler too." As I said, popular campaigning was important. It's called the Log Cabin and Hard Cider Campaign because they would construct these little mini log cabins and bring them out on the campaign trail and say, this is the type of home that William Henry Harrison grew up in. He's a commoner just like you. He's not fancy. He's not an elitist. And then they brought casks of alcoholic cider to all the campaign stops and gave out free drinks to everybody and got them liquored up and made sure that they remembered what a good time it was at the Harrison and Tyler rallies and hoped that that would pay off in the general election, which it did. They got elected. William Henry Harrison gave a longish inaugural speech. I think they said it was like an hour and 32 minutes or something like that. And supposedly didn't wear a jacket and it was cold outside. There's a lot of competing theories about what happened to him. That he got pneumonia because he didn't wear a coat and he spoke too long, that he had a viral infection, that he was poisoned. Like there's all kinds of different theories out there. But the one thing we are sure of is that 32 days after his inauguration, he died. It was the shortest presidency in U.S. history. John Tyler took over as president, and neither William Henry Harrison or John Tyler are really remembered for much because they are reigning over a time period where the main focus is on expanding to the West and the status of slavery in new states. And that will really be the handoff point for our next unit. If you have any questions about what I talked about today in this review lecture, please email me. I'm glad to clarify things, and I will see you next time.